Well, hello and welcome to Work Cookie, our weekly gathering of IOs, HR recruiters, and one actor, as we try to make the world of work just a little bit better. And LindaAnn, you're going to continue to lead our discussion, and today we're going to look at balancing act, juggling flexibility and accountability in remote work as we continue our discussion on remote. And anything that works with remote is going to work also with the hybrid employee, person who may be, working in the office 1 or 2 days a week to 1 or 2 days a month. Right?
Ah, the rose-colored glasses there, Tom.
I'm an actor. I can pretend really easily.
Okay, so today's topic is really about juggling flexibility and accountability in the remote work environment, right? And so let's talk a minute about flexible work practices and remote work, because they're not really the same. Flexible work practices come to be more of things that include part-time working, job sharing, telecommuting, which is kind of the remote work piece, but then compressed work weeks and any other variation that people can come up with, right? Those are the flexible ones. Then you've got the hybrid environment, and then you have total remote. So just so that we're clear about what we're really talking about as we come up with our comments and feedback and tidbits of scholarly information. So just some clarity on that. Now, when we look at some of the data, and I have posted the information in the chat. So let me see if I'll copy that and repost it. There we go. In general, when we're talking about the remote work environment, which seems to be the biggest challenge, right? There's variations in data about productivity. For the most part, data shows that remote workers tend to be more productive. And in some cases, some of the data that is in the references and so forth show that it can be up to 30% more productive because they're not getting interrupted. They're not spending time in the kitchen making their coffee. They're not, not going off site for an hour and a half lunch, all those kinds of things. So there is an increase in productivity there. There are delineations in people who can work remote, in general. It depends on the type of work. And there is a delineation based on, education level, because lower education levels tend to be jobs that don't really foster the remote work environment. So it's important to think about those pieces. When you are fully remote, however, there are the downsides, right? There's that Zoom fatigue, there's the lack of socialization, there's all of those pieces. And the counterpart to that is what they're seeing now is that people tend to be more productive if they have a friend at work, right? So how do you balance those pieces in how you're structuring your work environment? When you talk about hybrid, one of the recommendations that I remember seeing, I think it was from a study from Stanford, is that it's good to think about having people have the same days that they're remote, right? So that you don't have all the, your boss is in the office today, but you're not. His whole team is remote today. And so that's a waste of time or process. And so really think about, and then the collaboration doesn't happen if half your team is offsite one day and work the next day and vice versa. So really think consciously, if you're going to do the hybrid environment, think about consciously about how you want your team to work in that structure. What they're finding is that for hybrid, most people are most productive on, of course, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So you want to think about that. So anyway, those are some ideas to throw out there. And then you have to think about what are your best leadership and management practices to basically manage and monitor and get your goals achieved and have that accountability for those environments. So
Well,
with that,
yeah, and I think
great.
that's sort of the crux of the argument is how do we manage and lead remote teams? Because it seems that a lot of the organizations where they rejected remote work was because they have managers and team leaders who are like, if I can't walk down the hallway and see you, how do I know you're working? And so once again, it's about that accountability and how do we actually work in that accountability with flexibility. And it's every time I hear the statistics on how much more productive remote workers are when you do it right, the number seems to keep going up. But also, we can't discount that if you've got remote workers, you're also saving money on not needing office space downtown, which in a lot of cities is driving the downtown restaurants a little crazy. But I think we are seeing a change in the way people work, much like we did during the Industrial Revolution, where we're going to start to see, especially people who can work remotely, start to leave the cities and go to places where they think they're going to have a better quality of life. So I think we do need to focus on how do you actually make this work, because that really becomes the key. So thank you very much. Oh, go ahead, LindaAnn.
One thing, so one of the keys, and I think this is the one that falls by the wayside the most, is really making sure they have the technological tools to do it properly and give them the proper training, especially when you're bringing new people on board, because you're missing that side by side kind of process, right? So how do you replicate that or come up with something similar that works, that ends up with the same result, so that people get that kind of training? And training in general is kind of a marginal process for a lot of companies.
You're absolutely right, and sometimes it's not just about the training for the technology. It's about how do you set up a home office so that you have success. So there's a lot of issues to look at, and we've got some hands up. So let's go to some people. Dr. Martha, let's go to you first.
Well, there are a lot of variables that come into play here, a lot of moving pieces. First and foremost, not every employee is cut out to work remotely. You have to have a certain level of self-discipline, but you also have to have the right environment. Because if you don't have the right environment, if you have constant distractions and loud noises and interruptions at home, then that is simply not going to work, regardless of how focused you could uh, get yourself to be in general. So that's one of those things. But the other thing is managers really need to know their people, because I know that for the sake of fairness, organizations want to make rules across the board that apply to everyone. But the reality is that that's not necessarily the best thing in terms of what we get in return for our efforts. Like I said, some people simply may not do well, other people may do better. We've all experienced those coworkers who are endlessly chatty and you dread the sight of them because once they start to talk to you, you can't get rid of them. And when you're at home, that may be the best place to be away from that coworker. So, personality traits, the availability of what's available to the employee in terms of their own home environment, the manager's style. If you, as a manager, your only concern is that if I can't see you, I don't know if you're working, either you have some serious trust issues or you hired the wrong people. So there's a lot going on there too. So, this is a big topic to process. And I think for most organizations, it's too big for them to do it alone and do it successfully, because there are so many variables, there are so many things that come into play. And if you're going to successfully accommodate different individuals in different ways so that they can be most productive and most successful with your organization, you have to know how to do it right so that people don't sue you for favoring one over the other, because that could be very touchy. Some people are out there simply looking for an issue. So you have to do that skillfully. That's where getting someone like an IO psychologist into the situation to help can be very, very uh, productive in the end.
And if you missed that, hire an IO psychologist um, because they really do have the expertise you're going to need to make this transition. And it's funny because I've actually heard some stories now about how remote workers are, if they're working in a flexible team. So there's some remote workers and there's some people working in the office. It sort of gets a little unfair because the people working in the office get patted on the back for a good job all the time. And the people who are working remotely never hear a thank you or get a pat on the back because they're remote. So
But
you're right.
there's a flip side to that too, because if you're on site, when somebody shows up at your front door with a problem, the person who's working remotely is probably not going to have to deal with that. So there are pros and cons to the whole thing, right? You just have to be able to articulate that so that the audience doesn't think you're favoring one over the other.
It's a great example of why you want to hire an IO psychologist and not an actor to lead this transition. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Matt, let's go to you.
Flexibility and accountability, actually, we take a step back. That balancing act, that's just another way of saying what IOs, what we say all the time. It depends. So with each organization, that flexibility and accountability can look like a number of different ways. It depends on the organization, the people, your clients, your industry. Dr. Martha brought up a great example where if you're in the office and somebody comes to your office door, you can address that right away. Whereas if you're remote, you may be on the computer, you may not. What's the policy around your company? If your company says you're remote, but you are available during normal office hours, okay, that's one approach. Others that say, flexibility, as long as you get the product or the project done, your tasks done by this date, I don't care if you do it at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. Well, again, it depends on what that team, that organization, and your clients or whoever you're serving, what are all those factors? What are all those stakeholder needs? How are they being addressed? And yeah, over the last few years, there was a lot of very quick movement into remote, but what we are seeing is that pendulum is swinging back to it actually swung a little bit to everybody coming back to the office, and there's a lot of resistance to that. And that's where it's kind of finding its sweet spot in the middle, where there's a flexible hybrid sort of balance. Again, that's balancing act. It depends. And every organization, their task now is to figure out what works for them. Flexibility, what works for your team and your stakeholder. Do they need somebody available during normal office hours? I was talking with one individual, their business had a 4-day work week. You have the option, you can work 5 8-hour days or 4 10-hour days during certain parts of the year. The only catch to that was you had to get your 40 hours done by the end of the week, but it had to be during normal business hours because they still had clients calling them during those times. And if everybody said, you know what, I'm on vacation, I'm halfway around the world, so I'm getting my job done at 3 a.m. your time, that's not serving the client. It's actually taking away from that productivity. So even though there's a lot of research that says employees are more productive when they are remote or when they have more freedom and flexibility, what does that productivity actually mean? Because that can be a whole lot of different things. If you have clients or stakeholders that are dependent on certain responses in a timely manner, you may not be as productive. So really what it comes back to, yeah, that balancing act is just, it depends. And to echo what we always say, hire an IO. Get any one of us that are on this call. We can help navigate those conversations to help you identify what makes sense for your organization. And what makes sense today may change 6 months from now. We will be here again to help readjust as things move on.
I'd love to ask you, back in my day, because I'm old, the number one thing was salary. How much are we going to pay you? And we're now hearing that salary is not the number one issue anymore. So is it transitioning to, boy, if you can be flexible with employees, you're going to attract the best employees?
Again, I'm gonna say it depends. Just because pay it may not be the number one priority, it is still very much a priority. But what research has shown is that paychecks, they motivate you once or twice a month. Whenever that paycheck hits, right around that time, there's that boost, there's that jolt of energy and excitement, and that's what I seek with this company. But more and more, what we're finding is that, yeah, that ability to have flexibility. But what that also communicates is Do you trust your employees? If I'm saying, you know what, I'm hiring you and I'm giving you the best amount of money, but you know what, it's not going to be a great working environment. Well, if that's what I am communicating and you're okay with that, great. We've got a working arrangement. Is that going to work for everybody? Probably not, but for this situation, it might. If you are saying to an employee, you know what, I can pay you as much as I can, but I know that there's places that hire or that pay more. What are the benefits? What are the features? What's the support look like that you're providing to those employees for those employees to say, you know what, it's not worth an extra couple $100 to go work for that guy. You're offering me a lot more. And you're communicating that you trust me to get my job done. You're treating me like an adult. You're having these conversations with me. You're valuing me as a person. That's going to speak a lot of volumes. And yeah, you're probably going to have more engagement, more retention, and more attraction. People are going to say, I want to go work for that company. So to answer your question, Tom, yes, it's shifting away from money being the number one priority for driving where people want to work, but that's not going away. We still need a paycheck. We still need to pay our bills, but employees are starting to recognize, hey, there's other pieces that I can prioritize and I can include, and I value these things, and my employer should value them as well.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Matt. Lee, let's go to you.
Oh man, so much as usual. Yeah, no, the trust factor is huge, whether you're in the office or out. I mean, I worked for an organization one time that all of our cubibles, we refer to them as kindergarten walls because they were about yay high. And it was so that the owner could walk around and see who was there. And he would walk by at about 5 o'clock to see who was still there, because that was the thing. You were expected to put an extra hour or two in, and basically gratis, because you volunteered to do it. So there wasn't comp time, or there was all kinds of fuzzy stuff going on there. But it was unspoken. It was kind of one of those, somebody whispers in your ear, hey, you might want, if you want to, stick around and get promoted. But so our topic being flexibility, there are different levels of flexibility, and flexibility, it doesn't have just one clean answer. So my son has a hybrid job. They go in roughly 1 day a week, but his job also is required that it's an 8 to 5 job. So when he's working remote, he's still in the office 8 to 5. And that's an expectation. It was clearly communicated that is a business hour job. There are other jobs that's not the case, where you can work at 2 a.m. It doesn't matter. It's the product. It's not about I can pick up the phone and I can call and, Dr. Matt's going to answer, because, I don't care. If tomorrow morning my inbox has got the deliverable, then we're good. And then, then there's situations like the team that I currently have. We have core hours. You're kind of expected to be, available as much as possible during the core hours. So our flexibility tends to be, oh, you have an appointment. Okay, great. Just make up your time. And and we talked about whether you're paying for time or output. I mean, on a contract thing with billable hours, it's kind of both. So I need you to get your 8 hours in. And I mostly need them during business hours, because we have to react to people, clients and whatnot. But ultimately, are you doing the work? Am I getting, are you legitimately working the 8 hours, and you are giving me the results I need on time? And that's where we have to go. And I have some guys that are hybrid. Now, there's no flexibility on the day that you're on site. You got to be there during that shift. It's an expected thing. You're visible, blah, blah, blah. The rest of the time, we try to be max flexible to the extent we can for people, who have, life happens, right? The bad thing about business hours is that's when people do business. So, I got to go, I got an appointment. Well, when is it? During business hours. So, that's just where we are. And so you really have to take into account the situation. And, and pre-COVID, there were a lot of people who worked remote pre-COVID or hybrid, and it was considered usually a benefit. It wasn't everyone, and there was requirements. And usually there was some kind of a telework or remote agreement where these are the things that are required for you to do this. If you cannot meet these, or if your productivity slips, you will be expected to be back at your desk. And, and a lot of that was things like dedicated workspace, you had to provide your own internet because, again, it was a benefit, it was a Benny, it wasn't a requirement. So you had to have a certain level of speed for your internet because of being able to be productive. There were these things that you had to be able to check the box on in order to get that benefit. And you made that choice. Do I have that space? Can I take the spare bedroom and turn it into an office? And you have to make that, because I mean, let's face it, if you're sitting in an office, you're going to be more productive than if you're sitting on the couch with your feet up on the coffee table and, the daytime dramas are on on TV in the background. I mean, there's plenty of research that talks about distraction, but, so, you have to weigh these things. And so, there are some people who don't work well remote. There are some people that don't like to work remote. I mean, my wife, she used to work remote, and then, like COVID, they went, just like so many places, everybody go home. Well, she snuck back into the building essentially because it was easier for her. She had all the stuff. She had the printer. She had this thing, and there were enough times that she, quote, had to go in for something that finally her boss was just like, fine, go in the office, and so she was like the first person back working full time in the office because that was just the way it worked. And then me, I'm like, oh God, to go to the office. I mean, I don't want to do that. And, and I'm technically hybrid though. I mean, my going into the office requires an 18-hour drive, so I don't do that very often. But it is what it is. And so if you really want to control this, and it's not for everybody, there are some ways you could put some guardrails in that says, look, I'm not discriminating against anyone. These are the requirements. If you can hit these requirements and you can make your productivity, then we've got a conversation. If you cannot, then there's your answer. Your desk is over there. And, and you can do things like, okay, so you got to come in and do your training inside and whatever else. And, and then you have decisions about where people can live because they got to be able to commute. And, I mean, we had a guy that was complaining about commuting to on site, and it's like, well, you relocated. You went from like, half an hour or so to like 2 hours away. That's not my problem because you knew your work arrangement when you made that decision. So now that it's a problem, it's a you problem. And so there's all these things that, because people are people and people do unpredictable things. No matter how much years we've studied psychology, people do unpredictable things. So, and then after the fact, you go, oh yeah, I can see that. So,
Well, these are the days of our lives, Lee. Thank you very much for that. LindaAnn, let's go to you.
It looks like both LindaAnn and Tom are having some technical difficulties. So let's move on to Ian.
All right, I'll take over. So it's something that Lee, you mentioned that immediately sparked my interest. You were talking about the trust vector. And to me, that's kind of critically important from a number of different perspectives, especially from leadership of, to not dive too far down here, trust has kind of three components. It's ability, benevolence, and integrity. Do you have the ability to do what I'm trusting you to do? Do you have the benevolence in that you have my best interest in mind? And do our values align, and are your values known? And if those answers to those three questions are yes, I trust you. In the sense of remote work, that becomes exponentially more important because as a leader, I have to be able to say, I trust your ability, but no longer, usually if you're in work in person, it's I trust your ability. I can care about your integrity, I can care about your benevolence, but you're here, I know you're doing the work, I know you have the ability because that's what we selected you for. But when you're at home now, it's like, okay, I can trust your ability, but suddenly you get leaders who say, well, I don't think you're actually going to do the work. Well, interesting. Then you have something that you're not either trusting their benevolence, that they care about the company or their job or the position enough, or you're not trusting their integrity. In which case, to me, that's saying either we talk with kind of an executive coach and say, well, let's see why you're thinking that. Why do you feel so uncomfortable once you can no longer see your people? Or do you need to change part of your selection process to involve an integrity test to give you that extra level of assurance that if we then send people out to remote work, I know that you have the integrity, that you have the values match, and will be doing the work even if you're remote. And so building that into the selection side, not just the kind of allowing it to be an assumption and then having leaders panic when their people go remote. But Lee, you said trust, and that sparked me.
Let me ask you, Ian, because I'm not an IO. Is there an integrity test?
There are a few, and there are some that are more fun. I'll say from my the kind of IO nerd side of things, that are subtle integrity tests that masquerade as moral choice tests, or that masquerade as something else, but are actually testing your integrity. And then there's some pretty direct ones, and I always say to people, you'd be shocked how honest people will respond if you say, like, would you steal something? They're like, yeah, probably. You say, would you sell company information in a specific situation? They'll go, yeah, I think so. People will answer remarkably honestly, and you can cut out a whole bunch of people on those surface level integrity tests. But then there's also values match, and there are a couple different variants and organizational culture assessments and values surveys, which get at the idea of, we want to hire people with specific values. And you can choose exactly what those are, but they can align with self-determination, things that would incline you to believe that they will continue working while they are at home. And so you can build in those values as part of a values assessment. And that still talks to part of the integrity piece.
I like how sneaky you are. I like that. Thank you very much, Ian. LindaAnn, is your mic working now? All right.
Yes, it is. I figured out what that little problem was. Well, I love what Ian had to say, and especially when we talk about a values match, and my thing is organizational alignment. So when you have the proper recruitment process, you can do your best to get people who are aligned with the organizational values, and then and that's really important, because at some point down the line, the likelihood that dissonance would occur between how you want to conduct business and what their personal values are will surface. And so that can be really problematic. Just to go back a couple of steps, when we talk about some people want to come into the workplace and so forth, they're seeing that there's some generational differences, right? The Gen Zs want to come in, and some millennials on the younger end, because that's where they find their friends. And that's what, in a lot of cases, and has that meets that social need for them. So in some cases, they want to come in, and then as people stay with your organization, because they're gonna, and then those needs evolve, right? They need to be home to make sure that the dog can be let out, or that the washing machine can get fixed, or whatever that the kids needed to be picked up at soccer, and all those kinds of things. So the needs of your workers change, and you need to adapt to that. It's important, though, if you also have a lot of remote workers and you've instituted all these technologies to facilitate that remote work, that you haven't overwhelmed them with all of these, like, instant messaging and all these different places, because sometimes people have 3 or 4 different screens plus email or whatever open, and they're responding in all different ways. And I advise people or leaders to think carefully about what tools they're implementing, because you can end up with workers who spend way too much time just responding to just nonsense in a lot of ways, than instead of working, and do you owe everybody an instant response to what's being posted, and to really think about those guidelines that you put out there for them. And then I think one of the greatest challenges, though, and roadblocks, is that companies have in not effectively managing the remote or hybrid workers, is they didn't have good leadership or management practices in place before everybody went remote, and they still don't. And if you don't have good leadership practices and know what they are in general, it doesn't matter where people are or what they're doing, it's not going to work well as it could anyway.
Thank you very much for that. And, it's interesting when you talk about, generational workers, because, getting to my age now, I'm finding sometimes that I'm working with people who are, half my age, and I remind them of their father, and a lot of them don't have good relationships with their father. So what do you do? Thank you very much for that. Dr. Martha, let's go back to you.
Well, Tom, you brought up a very important question earlier about money, and Dr. Matt answered it so eloquently. I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that a lot of people started to reevaluate their priorities. So it's not that we no longer need money to pay the bills, like Dr. Matthew said, but we were given an opportunity through this upheaval of a pandemic to figure out that there's more to life than work, than career, and then to getting the highest pay possible. Being willing to sacrifice anything and everything for the highest pay is no longer the case for a lot of people. The other thing that happened during the pandemic is that companies were forced to very quickly realize that a lot of the jobs they would have never considered as suitable for remote work had to be remote, and so they were suitable for remote work if you just did whatever you needed to do to make it work. So that in itself, that forced move made it obvious to everybody that, hey, we don't all have to be at the office all the time. This isn't just a pipe dream to work remotely anymore. And I think that fed into that, dare I say, self-correction of self-priorities that happened for many people during the pandemic. And I think that's what we have moving forward. So I love Lee's story of his wife sneaking back into the office. I mean, there's a movie in there somewhere. Tom, maybe you could think about that. But that was great. But as we move forward, we have to pay attention to the lessons that we learned, whether we learned them willingly or we were forced to learn them. But the pandemic taught us a lot of things about the workplace, about the work setting, about ourselves, about our priorities. And so to go back to what LindaAnn said, if you as an employee didn't have great leadership when everybody was at the office, then that situation is going to get even worse when everybody was kind of left there with the rug pulled from under them when the pandemic happened. But the pandemic is over. Now is the opportunity for everybody to get it together, to apply the lessons that we learned during the pandemic, and to figure out how to make this work so that it works for everybody, the employer and the employee. But it's about the willingness for everybody to come together and do this. And I think a lot of times the willingness may not be there because people don't know what to do. Again, that's where an IO comes in. When you have some guidance, something tangible, something, a set of parameters to work with, such as what an IO can bring to an organization, it can make that learning process a lot smoother.
just listening to the Work Cookie podcast is a great training opportunity for all of those leaders who need to move to this new paradigm. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Martha. Rich, always good to see you. Let's go to you.
Well, thanks. Always good to see you too, Tom. I don't know if I have very much new to add to this, but I did want to say that the Gallup world was that the State of the World Global Workplace report came out recently, the 2024 edition, which is very similar to the 2023 edition in many respects, but it does say that 70% of, and this is the same thing they said last year, 70% of employee engagement is dependent on one's relationship with their manager and the effectiveness of that manager. So that goes directly with what Dr. G was saying there, I think. But the other thing I wanted to point out, though, was that so there, and I thought this was important to mention in this podcast, was that 20% of the world's employees experience daily loneliness. When they're so that loneliness, that contributes to lower performance ratings, difficulty concentrating, reduced creativity, loss of motivation. Right. So there's a lot of negative connotations or behaviors and effects that happen just with that affective situation, right? So they're feeling lonely and disjointed, and so that social interaction that they could get in the office, right? Having that flexibility where they can come into the office sometimes and work remotely, striking a balance there, I think, is an important thing to keep in mind.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because a few years ago, I had the opportunity to talk to a remote work expert in Ireland, where they've been doing this for a little while, even
Sure.
before the pandemic. And they talked about, there's certain, towns and communities where there are a number of remote workers, and they get together after work on Friday at the local pub. They all work for different companies, or there's a bunch of different companies, but they've formed their own little social group. So, I hope we start seeing more of that as well.
Sure. I mean, personally, I found, when we get together like this or at these events, virtually, that's great. But boy, when we get together at SIOP, it was, there were, just being in three-dimensional space with people, it was a very, very good experience that I cherished. So.
Well, now you have to tell me if Lee was asked for autographs when he was there. Thank you very much for that, Rich. Ian, let's go back to you.
Gosh, there's been so many things that I want to add a bit on. I think apropos of the most recent conversation and with the concept of Gen Z in the workforce, I shared in the chat the Murmuration report, which was, I think, a year ago or so now, looking at a few of the big changes. And one of the most significant was, instead of living to work, Gen Z shifting much more so to working to then go out and live and do other things and have those other social interactions. And there's a concept of the third place. And there's a lot of research and conversation around this, of having your home, your work, but then also having a third place to be, to exist, to have social interactions, and not only having your home and your work. And that can become increasingly important when you then condense home and work into one space. And then, assuming you don't have a whole house where you can go into your own separate office from where you sleep, from where you eat, it's just, a studio apartment, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom. You've now condensed that quite a lot, and you may have removed your home is now your work, and there's some boundary breaking there. And so the third place becomes really important. You were mentioning going out to the bar, finding a club, having a hobby. Those all become increasingly important, and I think something that many people will overlook, even in their own work, of they kind of forget that there is another place that's not just homework in the grocery store, like a place that's actually somewhere you can go and socialize, and being very intentional about that. Of course, I'll be a little bit biased here because a lot of my research is in nature and nature contact. saying, I'm going to stop work for now, go outside and take a walk. And then the leadership side, making sure that that's enabled, that you're saying, hey, if you want to take a break during the workday, whether in person or virtual, that's okay. I encourage you to go outside and take a 10-minute, 20-minute, 30-minute walk. And if you can put your thing away for 30 minutes on a break, good, because I expect that means you're taking care of yourself. You're engaging in something else. And so from a number of different perspectives, both employee things that you can do and leadership, what you can encourage, encouraging people to go outside or to have that third space, I think is incredibly important, especially more so now that people are beginning to work remotely or hybrid or losing that third space.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I love nature too. I'd just rather work in a cabin in the woods. That'd make me happy. Thank you very much for that. Ian, Dr. Matt, let's go back to you.
What Ian was just saying about step outside for 30 minutes and your leader saying, go do that. I want you to do that. That right there is a perfect example of a leader navigating that balancing act and juggling that flexibility and the accountability, that recognizing for 30 minutes or an hour while my employee is out taking a walk, getting fresh air, getting out in nature, which there's a whole bunch of research that shows the physical and mental benefits to that. That's for a different conversation for a different day. But for the manager that can recognize for those 30 minutes or 1 hour, that employee is technically not producing for me. Yeah, but when they come back, how much more effective are they? And again, I use this analogy all the time. It's not like a washcloth that you're trying to wring out more water, but sometimes you just need to let something breathe a little bit, let something reset a little bit, calm the waters, and then imagine how much more productive they can be when they come back, how much more effective they are doing their task. And there's a whole bunch of research that really re-emphasizes that. So I'm really glad that Ian brought that up. And to go back to what Dr. Martha was saying about post-COVID being able to apply the lessons that we learned. One of the things that I have, I've been in a couple of conversations around this, and I've seen it actually taking place. There's a lot of reverting back to old habits because people don't know how to change that. They may start to understand, get a little bit more clarity around the why we should change it. And again, there's that word, we should change this. Okay, but why or how? And really the way I look at it from a psychology perspective, we're all psychologists here. Human behavior is fascinating. Behavior change can be easy on paper, but it can be very difficult in reality. The theories, the research, the findings, they can all be great and much of the time, but people's behavior can be very rigid. When you find your comfort zone, it can be very hard to change that. And so what COVID did was it voluntold that change for a lot of people. You went from in the office 1 week to you're at home and you're figuring out. And once you figured it out and you got it set, okay, now I'm adjusting and adapting to this new environment. Well, as companies are starting to say, yeah, but let's revert back to these previous behaviors because of whatever their reasoning is, to change that behavior back is starting to prompt a lot of, but why? And if you communicate that why, there may be some understanding where the two sides, the opposing sides, I want to stay remote, I want to be in person, I want something in between. You can find that balance that says, this is what flexibility and accountability look like to us. And to mention what Rich was talking about with the loneliness epidemic, that can be a very significant factor that influences why we need to return to the office, or can influence the argument of why we need to return to the office. There's that false narrative of, if we go back to being in person, we won't have loneliness anymore because we didn't have it then. Well, the reality is we actually did, but it was just a wolf in different clothing, And so when you take a step back and you look at your current situation and you say, okay, if we're trying to find what that balance looks like for us, here's an opportunity for us to reimagine what those possibilities can be, what we can do to counteract or to avoid or to minimize that loneliness epidemic. And Tom, I lit up with a giant smile when you talked about the Irish pub, because having been to Ireland a few times, I can tell you, and when I was there, it was before the pandemic. It didn't matter what kind of work you did; that it was a cultural thing to be to gather with people on a regular basis. And I can go on a number of stories about that. But the point being, when organizations look to identify what does their balancing act look like, what does that mean to them, and when you include all those different factors, including that loneliness factor, what does it look like for you and your team and your people to address that while still moving forward with these new behaviors that we've learned and we have recognized they kind of work, or they can work.
Well, part of the highlight of my week, as I've said many times, is getting together with you folks. It's such a wonderful group just to hang out with, and you're all so smart. So this is kind of like my Irish pup right now. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Matt. LindaAnn, let's go to you.
Yeah, I think we all need our own personal cheers, and to what was a comment that was made earlier about from Ian about having that third place or whatever. When I was in my early 30s and I was in the DC area, which is an insane place for how people work, it's a badge of honor if you put in 100 hours, and I was never going to do that. I said that I used to say I work so that I can live the rest of my life, because I had a lot of other things going on that I wanted to do. So yeah, I was never going to be that person there till 11 o'clock at night on a regular basis. So one of the things that when we went into COVID and I would talk to businesses, I would encourage them to experiment. I said, this is the greatest opportunity for experimentation where you won't have to really suffer any consequences. Because if it doesn't work, people will go, oh, well, that didn't work. We're just trying to figure it out, right? So really thinking about what you want to do. There's a little bit of grace even now if you're trying to figure it out to make an accommodation to people. So I would say if you have an idea about how this might work for you and your team, take that risk, because whatever works, and that's all that needs to take place. The other thing that I want people to think about is really the role that career development can play in the remote work environment. Because your younger generations really do care about career development more than they care about that extra $10,000, really think about how you're having your leaders do that for them, because that's what's going to help them stay with your organization. And what they say is, salary isn't a primary motivator. You have to pay industry standard salaries. That's all there is to it. If you think you're going to get a bargain, it's going to cost you more down the road in a couple of different ways. You need to pay industry standard salaries. That's the hygiene, right? That's the just basic expectation. If you pay less, then that's a demotivating factor. But it's not going to, the extra $1,000 or whatever is not going to change how someone performs for you. And when in the recruitment process, I used to have those arguments all the time. Well, if they want an extra $1,000, I mean, can you afford not to give them the extra 1,000? Or are you going to wait another month and spend all of what it takes to get that unicorn that you want? So there's that, but really career development can go a long way with your team.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, have the same philosophy with trainers. Like, I have been in too many organizations where someone took a course and now they're doing the training for the rest of the team, and they're reading from the handout they got from the course, and there's little to no value in it. That's why, and quite frankly, as an employee, when I have to go to those types of training sessions, how much do you value me as an employee that you're not willing to spend the money to actually bring an expert in? It feels like a slap in the face. So, not only pay those industry standards for your salaries, but when you reach out to someone like an IO, well, actually reach out to someone like an IO, don't save the money and have Bob down the hallway doing the training. So thank you very much for that, Linda. And Dr. Martha, back to you.
What a great point, Tom. Thank you. Rich brought up such an important idea, the idea of loneliness, because this is real. And I've seen this be a reality for many people. But personally, I've seen it a reality for many older employees. Maybe they are widowed at that point in their life. Their children live away, whatever reason. That office time is one of the biggest opportunities for them to be social with other human beings. And that's something that organizations really need to pay attention to, because it's so easy to overlook that as you're focusing on numbers and focusing on making the rules the same for everybody. And what Ian brought up, that idea of having that third place, without it, your world can become very, very small, very, very quickly, when all it is getting up, going to your desk, and that's it. So as psychologists, we think about these things because it has to do with people's experiences and people's behaviors and everything to do with people. But so often organizations overlook that. So often organizations tend to think about employees as a collective, and they're more worried about getting sued over looking like they're favoring someone rather than tailoring the workplace experience to people in such a way that is still fair, but is a win-win for everybody who is involved.
And it's, if you hire an IO psychologist, it ain't that hard. Just hire them, let them do the work. Thank you very much, Dr. Martha. Lee, back to you.
Such great points as always. Some of the things that I thought of when, just from the various comments is, one thing that people don't necessarily consider when they're remote is co-working spaces. There are, talk about an interesting, business idea, that there are spaces out there that it's just office space, and you can rent it by the hour, you can rent it by the day, by the week. You can, there's one in Memphis here that they've got like an open space, kind of concept. You can rent a conference room, you can rent a private office, and so, different, obviously different costs involved there. So that, for people who work remotely, if you need that people fix, you can go and you can work in a space with other people. And, and I've not personally done it, so I can't vouch to how, how I'm sure there's some kind of guidelines that, you're not distracting someone who's got a deadline or something, but, but that's an option, to get out. And another thing that I think was interesting is I've seen a couple of cities, including the one where the university I attended is located, as a matter of fact, who actually the cities had put out a thing that said, hey, remote workers, if you'll move here and bring your remote work with you, we'll pay you, $10,000 or whatever it is. Because, they're looking for the population, and they're not that tech center or that industry center. And so they're looking to bring in that population, and their paychecks, and that they're willing to pony up to get you to go there, which I thought was really interesting. I saw one, like a week or two ago. It was something, I forget where it was, somewhere in Midwest. But I thought that was kind of fascinating. And to go back to, the whole, our underlying topic, the flexibility is the separation, because we're flexible, if you're in a flexible situation where you can work at any time and we don't care or whatever, there needs to be some understanding there. What is the expectation? If we're in a flexible environment and you send me an email at 10 p.m., when am I expected to answer that? And that's a very real thing, and there are email programs that, in Outlook, you can go in and it says, you can set your office, you can set your work hours in your Outlook. And then when somebody goes to email you within your system, it says, do you want to schedule this to be delivered during office hours for that person? So that's one thing you can do, or you can just make it in, with mine, I told my people, I don't do email on my phone. I don't do Teams on my phone. I don't do Slack on my phone. If there's something that's happening after hours and you need me, you need to call or text. Just that easy. If I need to do something, that's one thing, but I am not sitting around just waiting for something work to come in. So, oh my God, I feel important. I got an email at 10 o'clock. And, I actually saw an article where it was some CEO of some, I don't know. And they were like, oh, well, when I'm interviewing somebody for this such and such level position, I send them something over the weekend that I need to have this information before we continue this process because I want to see how long it takes them to respond. And I'm like, what a crock of what? Let's have some respect, people. Am I paying you for if I'm paying you for your time, then I should be paying you overtime if you're checking your email at 10 o'clock on Saturday evening. That or you need to get a life, we need to have chat about that. But and it's incumbent on both sides. As an employee, you have to set your boundaries. Like I told, it's my boundaries. I told them, when the workday is done, I'm done. If you have something, that's cool, but you're going to have to go through a different channel to reach me. And, I made that clear at the beginning and they respected it. In fact, my boss called me last night. I am so sorry to call you after hours, but this thing came up. Cool. We have an understanding. And from the other side, you have to respect that. If you're one of those people that checks your email at, midnight on Saturday, great. Good for you. But don't expect anyone to read it. Don't expect anyone to respond to it. Not till Monday morning. And if you really want to be respectful of that time, because, you have some people, set that timer, deliver at 8 a.m. Monday morning. And it's funny from the other side, back to my wife, I'm sure she'd be thrilled I'm telling stories on her, but we were in Europe on vacation and she was checking email on her phone. And she got an email from one of her coworkers that said, if you don't stop, we're shutting off your access. And she it was funny, she kind of panicked. She was like, please don't do that. I won't respond to anything else. Don't do that. But that was great on the other side that you're on vacation, not just on vacation, but you're on another continent. Knock it off. And we need to do that. We need to be that respectful of our people. When the stuff hits the fan, it's one thing, but on a regular day, I don't need to talk to you till tomorrow or Monday, whatever the case is. Let's really respect the time away. Let's respect the PTO. And, and that goes back to the trust and all these other things we've talked about. But it is a very important thing that is often overlooked.
Well, isn't that like, let's promote IO psychology just a little bit more. Isn't that another great example of, because it's not just when we contact each other, it's how we're contacting each other, synchronous versus asynchronous communication. And isn't that another great place for an IO to come in and navigate that path so that as the team builds, we're all like on the same page?
Absolutely. Because really a lot of what this comes down to is a psychological contract.
Yeah.
And clearly communicating and managing the expectations. I tell my people, I have expectations and you need to know what they are. But so do you. What are your expectations of me as your supervisor? And we have to have that conversation. We should have that conversation because it is a two-way street. And, like just as you said, when are you expected to respond? Well, between the hours of 10 and 2, Eastern Standard Time, I expect you to respond within a few minutes. Okay, expectation there. If it's, Saturday or if it's, 7 p.m., my expectation is you'll answer tomorrow morning. Awesome. Or, if it's emergent kind of thing, what is the expect? Well, I expect you to take a look. If it's important, answer it. If it's not, answer me tomorrow. But at least look. Okay, well, that's communicated clearly and we've agreed upon that. And that's kind of the, we got to get rid of this command and control stuff. A work relationship is exactly that. It's a relationship. It's an agreement. It's a contract, a compact, call it whatever you want, but that's what it is. There has to be agreement on both sides. We work at will. And if you don't honor that, someone else will.
Thank you very much, LindaAnn, and back to you.
So I just wanted to, where it's time for us to kind of wrap up, I just wanted to bring a reminder. I've mentioned this before, for people that are looking for ways for people in the remote workforce to connect and share information and things like that. One of the best kind of events that I used to have with an organization is the annual vacation photo contest. And you can do that whether it's remote or in person, but it's a great Teams thing. And you create a channel for your photo contest. And it starts, I used to make the announcements a little late. I used to do it right at Memorial Day. It was open for all summer. There were a couple rules. One, it could only be 3 photos. It had to be from this year's vacation. Couldn't use any Photoshop or Dolly or anything on your stuff. And then we would close it at the end of the summer. Everybody got to vote on each of the photos, you know. And then the prize was the top 3 winners got framed copies of their photo, and the photos were amazing, right? And so they could put it in their office, they could put it in their home, whatever, but they got a really nice framing of their photo. Super inexpensive, created so much buzz among the team, and yeah, really helped people understand, know where you're going and what are you, you know, and learning about you and things like that. So it's a real easy thing to do. Creates a lot of it's very fun for the team, and creates a little bit of cohesion.
Well, thank you very much. And you're right, we are out of time. So are there any other little last thoughts or pieces of advice, nuggets of wisdom you want to share with us?
I don't have anything other than listen to Ian. I think there's a good.
You might be right. Ian's absolute pleasure having you join us today. And for anyone who's listening to the Work Cookie podcast, don't forget that we do this live every Thursday, 12 Eastern, and you're more than welcome to hop on and join us. Just go to the CBOC website and get your ticket. Well, with that, LindaAnn, it looks like next week we're going to continue to talk about this, but we're going to focus a little bit more on leadership, thank goodness. We're going to look at managing from afar, leadership practices for remote managers. Can you give us a little highlight on that?
I cannot, but I'm looking forward to it. But leadership is a real passion of mine, and making sure that people have take the time to develop their leadership skills whatever their work situation is key to success, and can solve a lot of problems. It's just really all of those things. I forget who it was that brought it up, the Gallup workplace and whatever. It's all the engagement, all those kinds of things are the variances are directly correlated to how their leader manages them. So,
And if you're a leader, you got to tune into the podcast. If not, join us live and take advantage of asking these people some actual questions. So with that, LindaAnn, thank you very much. And I think it's time for us to go. So if you want to count us out, we'll see everyone back here in 1 week's time.
thank you, everyone. 3, 2, 1. Till next time.